tonight we're going to be talking about God's existence. And I'm going to actually be teaching this class a little bit differently than I have in the past. So in the past, when I talk about God's existence, it's usually like, let's provide some arguments and evidence for God's existence, maybe look at some evidence and arguments against God's existence, and then kind of come to the happy conclusion that God exists. But what I've kind of concluded is that a lot of people don't even really know what to do with arguments and evidence. So I think there's actually some kind of like foundational level work that we need to do first to kind of put the evidence in its proper context, to really understand what the evidence is doing and accomplishing. And the reality is, when it comes to kind of the debate that's going on out there over around God's existence, the sad reality is that it often really has almost nothing to do with evidence. If you kind of pay attention, it's a lot about like, how do we define atheism? Who has the burden of proof? And just different things like that. So I think we need to talk about some more kind of foundational level issues. So that's what I'm going to start with, trying to make two kind of more fundamental philosophical points. And the first point has to do with the task at hand. There are three stances or three positions that you can take with respect to any idea or proposition. You can believe that proposition, you can disbelieve that proposition, or you can withhold or suspend judgment. Basically not make a judgment to believe or disbelieve either way with respect to that proposition. So let's just consider this with this concept or this proposition in mind. Chuck Allers was born in New York. So that's the kind of proposition that we're working with right now. Chuck was born in New York. So with respect to this, you have three options. You can believe it. Oh yeah, I do think Chuck was born in New York. You can disbelieve it. No, I don't think Chuck was born in New York. I'm pretty sure he was born in Jersey. Or you can just withhold judgment. Who's Chuck? Or I've absolutely never spent any time thinking about where Chuck was born, and so I can't believe or disbelieve either way. The important question becomes, which position should you take? What ought you believe? And the answer to that is dictated by the evidence available. Meaning, you ought to believe in line with the evidence for that proposition in question. That's what rational people do. That's what reasonable people do. And to help us kind of like think through this, I'm going to give you a way too simplistic visual aid. And this is just basically a vertical line. And the idea being, with respect to any idea, but right now we're thinking about Chuck was born in New York. As you kind of gain evidence for that proposition, you kind of move from that midpoint up the line. As if you have evidence against it, it would kind of move you down that line. So, when it comes to this, Chuck was born in New York. What would kind of lead you to rationally believe something like this? Well, if all things considered, so all the information you have available, on balance, the evidence lies in favor of this proposition, in favor of the idea that Chuck was born in New York, then you ought to believe it. So for example, maybe you've talked to Chuck, and I was born in New York, and you have no reason to disbelieve him. Or maybe you look at the Branch, his biography on Branch website. It's like, Chuck Allers was born in New York. If the evidence on balance lies in favor of the proposition, you ought to believe it. But not only that, what I want you to see is, not only are you rationally justified to believe it, but if the evidence points strongly in favor of the proposition like this, it would actually be irrational to disbelieve or to withhold judgment. If all the evidence that you have to go on is that, yeah, Chuck was born in New York, it wouldn't make any sense not to believe that. Or even to say, I'm going to just suspend judgment, right? So you actually ought to believe it. What about withholding? What would cause you to withhold judgment on something like this? Well, typically we withhold judgment on things that we're, first of all, ignorant about. So maybe you genuinely have never thought or never heard anything about where Chuck was born, right? Then you're just going to withhold judgment. You can't really believe or disbelieve. Either that, or sometimes the kind of balance of the evidence counterbalances. So it's kind of like equal evidence for something, equal evidence against something. So in this case, maybe you're like, yeah, I think I've heard that Chuck was born in New York, but someone else, didn't they say he was born in Jersey? And so the evidence is kind of equal both for and against. So you basically can't rationally believe or disbelieve either way, so you withhold judgment. So if there's no evidence, or if the evidence kind of counterbalance, your almost rational duty is to suspend judgment. What about disbelieving? Disbelieving is similar to believing. If the evidence on balance lies against the proposition in question, then you're justified in disbelief. What I want you to notice here with disbelieving something, notice that you would actually need evidence against the proposition to get there, to get down there to where it's rational to disbelieve. Meaning it's not enough just to show that there's no arguments in favor. So if all you're going on is that, well, I've never heard any arguments or any evidence that Chuck was born in New York, that wouldn't be enough to disbelieve. That would just say, okay, I don't have evidence either way, so I'm going to withhold judgment. So to actually disbelieve, you need actually evidence against the proposition in question. Does that make sense? The main points that I want you to take away here is that when it comes to any of these three stances, belief, disbelief, withholding, or suspending judgment, whether or not you're rationally justified to take that stance is based on the evidence available. Meaning, with regard to any of those three positions that you take with regard to any idea or proposition, you're basically saying, all things considered, this is the best stance to take. Let's apply this to a slightly more important proposition than where Chuck was born. And this is the proposition, God exists. Once again, there are three stances that you can take with respect to this proposition, that God exists. You can believe, that's theism. A theist believes that God exists. You can disbelieve, that's atheism. An atheist believes that there is no God. God does not exist. Or you can withhold or suspend judgment. This is agnosticism. An agnostic says, I don't know either way. I can't make a judgment to believe or disbelieve either way. The question once again becomes, which stance should you take? The evidence will dictate that. And the most important thing I want you to realize here is that each of these positions requires reasons to justify that stance. There's no default position. The only kind of default position is just ignorance. I've absolutely never thought about this, but once there's evidence available, it's that evidence that will determine which position you ought to take. Okay? So let's begin with agnosticism, kind of evaluating this. When it comes to agnosticism, the thing that I want you to realize the most is that agnosticism is a position. If you're agnostic, that's your stance. What you're effectively saying is that given my evidence, given all things considered, I'm going to withhold judgment. That's the best position that I can take. And what you would need to really justify agnosticism is that you would need the evidence to be balanced. So either there's no evidence for God's existence, there's no evidence against God's existence. So it just kind of leaves you in the middle, or the evidence is equal each way. The evidence for God's existence is just as compelling as the evidence against God's existence. So you see how it kind of just balances out. But what I want you to see is, do you see why that would be the only way to really rationally justify agnosticism? Because if the evidence points you in one way or another, it's like then why not just believe or disbelieve? Why would you withhold judgment if the evidence is pointing you in one direction or another? So really the only way to actually really justify agnosticism is if the evidence just balances out. And this gets to what I think is really the absurdity of agnosticism. Many people think that, especially with respect to God's existence, being agnostic is just kind of like this safe, comfortable position. Oh, I don't really know anyway. I don't really have anything to defend. I'm not making any sort of claim. And so it's just this safe, comfortable position, but it's really not, at least rationally speaking. You have to justify that stance too. And because of this, I actually think I think it's really an absurd position. Do you really think that there's no evidence either way for God's existence? Or do you really think that the evidence is just perfectly balanced? Typically when people say that they're agnostic, I don't mean this as an insult, but I typically just assume they've never thought about it. They've never really investigated. Because think of it this way. One way or another, in reality, either God exists or he doesn't. So those are the only two options. And think of all the thought, all the debate throughout human history with respect to God's existence. Given all of this, given that God exists, given all the time that we've spent thinking about this thing, do you really think that the evidence is at a standstill? Do you really think that the evidence doesn't push you one way or another to believe or disbelieve? And so because of this, I actually think agnosticism is really an absurd, almost untenable position. What about atheism? In order to justify atheism, the balance of the evidence would have to weigh against the proposition, against God's existence. And here, once again, here's where I want you to see that in order to get here, in order to rationally justify atheism, you would actually need evidence against God's existence. Meaning it's not enough just to say there's no good reasons to believe in God. And you hear this all the time. Hey, why are you an atheist? Why don't you believe in God? Well, I just don't think there are any good evidence, or I don't think there are any good arguments for God's existence. That doesn't actually get you there. If that's all that you're having to go on, there's no good arguments for God's existence, but you don't actually have arguments or evidence against God's existence, that would just leave you at a standstill. That would justify agnosticism, but not atheism. And so the main point I want you to get here is that there's no amount of rejecting a theist's evidence that will ever lead to atheism. You actually have to have your own case, your own evidence, your own arguments against God's existence. An atheist would immediately push back here. And what they would say is that's not fair. And they would say that's not fair because you can't provide evidence or arguments that something doesn't exist. You hear this often said, like, you can't prove a negative, or you can't prove a universal negative. You can't provide evidence or arguments against God's existence. And the response is, sure you can. God's existence is a falsifiable proposition. What do I mean by that? I don't mean that God's existence is false. When I say falsifiable, what I mean is that you can provide evidence or arguments against it, or you could possibly provide evidence or arguments against it, and that evidence would mean something. So, for example, you could potentially show that the idea of God is incoherent. Maybe there's different things that we attribute to God that just can't coexist. So this is basically what the problem of evil type argument does. So the problem of evil argument says, if God were truly all good and all powerful, we wouldn't see the level of evil and suffering that we see in this world. So effectively, meaning, if God were truly all good, he would want to get rid of the evil. If he were truly all powerful, he would be capable of getting rid of the evil and suffering that we see in this world. So it's effectively choose one of those things. Either God is all powerful, and so he's able to get rid of the evil, but he's not good enough to actually want to do it. Or he's all good, but maybe he's just not capable of getting rid of the evil. So you effectively have to choose. Those two things can't go together given the conditions in the world. Or there's arguments that if God is truly sovereign, if he's truly in control, human beings can't truly be free. We can't have free will. Similar arguments, if God is truly omniscient, if he's truly all-knowing, if he knows what you're going to do in the future, then you're not really free to decide. So you either have to give up like his sovereignty or his omniscience or human freedom, and I'm like, we can't give up any of those things. So maybe the concept of God is incoherent. Or there's potential arguments that if God existed, certain evidence would show up that doesn't, and so God probably doesn't exist. So this is like divine hiddenness type arguments. If God truly existed, he would make his existence much more obvious than he does. And since he doesn't, he probably doesn't exist. The point that I just want you to get right now is that there are certainly possible ways to provide evidence against God's existence, to provide arguments against God's existence. Now, if someone can't actually do that, if someone can't actually provide evidence or arguments against God's existence, that's not my problem. If people have given up on these arguments because they're truly failed arguments, That's exactly what I would expect, right? I don't expect there to be actual good arguments or evidence against God's existence. I think that God exists. But notice the fact that there are failed arguments or that those arguments don't actually work. That doesn't mean that the proposition itself is unfalsifiable, that you can't even provide evidence or arguments in theory. Does that make sense? And I kind of harp on this because there has been just so much when it comes to this debate, and if you paid attention to this debate over God's existence, you've realized this. There's been such an effort to redefine atheism, to make it so that atheist doesn't have any burden of proof. You hear it all the time, like, I have nothing to defend. I'm not making any claim. Oh, I'm an atheist. That just means I just simply lack belief in God. There's nothing for me to defend. And to me, this is just a giant cop-out. And it's a giant cop-out because everyone has beliefs. All of these positions, they represent a stance that needs to be justified, a stance that needs to be defended. And so this effort to kind of like redefine atheism, to make it so that atheist doesn't have any burden of proof, to me, that's more evidence that atheism is just a bankrupt position. You can't defend your beliefs, so you basically argue that you shouldn't have to. What about theism? What would justify theism? If the evidence available on balance lies in favor of God's existence, then you have a rational duty to believe. Now, before we actually get into the evidence, I want to make one more kind of preliminary point. And this has to do with standards of proof. And the point that I want to make is that knowledge does not require certainty. Meaning, to say that you know something, to say that you can prove something, that doesn't mean that you're certain of it. By that I mean, to say that you know something doesn't mean that there's no possibility that you're wrong. Let me give you an example. I think I know, I'm pretty sure I know, that I'm not alone in this room right now. I think I know that there are people in front of me. And you naturally want to say, of course you know that. You can see people in front of you, right? And I think you're right. The question is, could I possibly be mistaken about this? Yes. This could be a super vivid dream. God could be giving me a super vivid vision right now. Think about it. Whether you think that God is actually doing that or not, does anyone doubt that God could give me some sort of experience of people right here, with me being alone, that's every bit as vivid as this experience that I'm having right now? Of course he could. So there's the possibility that I'm mistaken about this. Have you guys ever heard of Rene Descartes? Very famous philosopher, and this kind of goes along with some of his most famous work. Maybe you've heard of his most famous quote, "I think, therefore I am." Do you know where that quote comes from? I will explain it to you. Descartes was kind of responding to the skeptics of his time. And so his sort of philosophical project was, he was like, I want to see what I can know while at the same time holding me to the highest standards of skepticism possible. And basically what he said, I think I believe a lot of things, I think I know a lot of things, but if there's any possibility that I can even doubt it, if there's any possibility that I'm wrong, I'm not going to count it as an item of knowledge. And his famous kind of thought experiment was this great evil god or this great evil demon that was potentially deceiving him. So for example, if I'm Descartes right now, it's like, I think there's a podium in front of me. I think there are people in front of me. I think I know certain things about myself, my hair color or whatnot. But the question was, could I possibly doubt those things? And the answer is yes. I could be being deceived by this great evil demon about all these things. It's at least possible, so those can't count as items of knowledge. Descartes came to the conclusion that there's at least one thing that he can know with certainty, that he couldn't possibly doubt. And that's that he existed. And his reasoning was this: even if I'm being deceived about all of these other things, I must at least exist to be kind of like the object of that deception. As long as he's thinking, even if all of those different thoughts are kind of deceptions, he must exist to even be able to be deceived. If that makes sense. I think, therefore I am. The conclusion or what I'm trying to illustrate here is that knowledge doesn't require certainty. Because there are very few, if any, things that you're actually certain about. Right? You think you know a lot of things, but you're not actually certain about these things. It's at least possible that you're wrong. So if your level of knowledge is certainty, the basic point is basically you don't know almost anything. You know that you exist and maybe a few different things. But the reality is, and something that we all recognize, is we do know a lot of things. Right now, I do know that there are people in front of me. You do know that you're in this room right now. You do know that grass is green and different things like that. And so if you do know these things, even though you're not certain, well then it seems like, or what the logical conclusion is, that knowledge must not imply certainty. It must not require certainty. So for example, when I say I know people, I know there are people in this room with me, I know that you guys are here. Could I be possibly wrong? Sure. Could I be being deceived? Could I doubt this? Like, is this all a vision? Yeah, it's possible, but it wouldn't be reasonable to think those things. It wouldn't be rational to think those things. And so I do know these things. The reason why I bring this point up is because I think it's important, because a lot of people make this mistake kind of implicitly on both sides of the debate with respect to God's existence, theists and atheists. You hear people say all the time, well, could you possibly be wrong about this? Could you be mistaken about God's existence? And it's like, yeah, I could be. And so then people conclude, they're like, oh, see, no one really knows. I'm like, that doesn't follow at all. And beyond that, this helps us to see what we're actually claiming. When we claim that we can know God exists, when we claim that God exists, when we claim that we can prove God exists, what we're not saying is, we're not saying that we know that God exists with like a mathematical certainty. We're not saying that we have everything about the concept of God figured out. We're not saying that there aren't flaws in our conception or our rationalization about God. We're not saying that there's no possibility of us being mistaken. When we say that we can know God exists, we can prove God exists, what we're effectively saying is the evidence is such that it's reasonable to believe in God's existence and it's irrational not to. And that's where the state of the evidence is. So let me provide or give you kind of some arguments and evidence for God's existence. I'm not going to really defend any of these properly. It's going to be more like a survey to kind of just introduce you to some of the evidence and arguments for God's existence. One of the most popular arguments for God's existence has to do with the first cause. So you're effectively asking, what caused everything to exist? What brought the universe into existence? And typically when it comes to first cause type arguments, the first step is establishing that the universe has a beginning point, meaning that the universe is not eternal. It began some point in the finite past. Why do we know that the universe had a beginning point, or how do we know? There's a ton of scientific reasons, there's a ton of philosophical reasons. We'll just go through a few of them. What are the scientific reasons that we know the universe had a beginning? For one, there's a finite amount of and this is, if you're a true scientist, I know this is like overly simplistic, but there's a limited amount of usable energy in the universe. So eventually the universe will run out of usable energy and we'll reach a place or a state of equilibrium which is just effectively the end of the universe. How does that point to a beginning point? If the universe truly were eternal, if it's always existed, it's existed forever, we would have already ran out of usable energy by now. An infinite amount of time is plenty of time to run out of a finite resource. So the mere fact that we still have this finite resource left and in operation helps us show that the universe must have a beginning point. It's not eternal. The expansion of the universe is evidence that the universe began to exist. So our universe is expanding outward. If you kind of rewind that picture or kind of move into the past, if we're expanding outward this way, if you kind of rewind the past, the universe effectively collapses back upon itself. And it gets to this like ultimate beginning point, which cosmologists talk about as the singularity. And that's just that singular point where the entire universe kind of came into existence and started that expansion outward. There are different models of the universe that try to explain the expansion of the universe while keeping the universe eternal. So there's different like oscillating models where the universe is like expanding and contracting just for eternity. These models, I'm not going to defend this. I don't even think I really could. But these models don't work for various reasons. The best model of the universe still is the standard model of the universe, more commonly referred to as the Big Bang model of the universe, which implies an absolute beginning point. So the scientific evidence, there's much more than this. All the scientific evidence that we have points to the universe having a beginning. If for some reason that scientific evidence changed, it won't. But if it did, we would still have philosophical reasons to know that the universe began to exist. Track with me. One of the philosophical reasons is the impossibility of crossing an infinite gap one step at a time. If I asked you right now, count to infinity for me, you would laugh. You should laugh. You wouldn't even try, would you? And the reason why you wouldn't try is because you know that that's an impossible task. You can't count to infinity. Not only that, you can't actually get any closer. If, for example, you had been counting your entire life, and let's say you're on like 100 trillion, you're actually no closer to infinity than when you started. You're still an infinite amount of numbers away. And this is because it's impossible to kind of cross an infinite gap in this manner. If the universe truly is eternal, if it's always existed, what this would mean is that before this point, before the present, there's an infinite amount of time that came before us. There's an infinite amount of moments that came before the present. That's impossible. We would have never reached the present because that would mean that we would have crossed over this infinite gap one moment at a time. Meaning that the mere fact that we're at the present is actually evidence that the universe had a beginning point. It began some point in the finite past. And I get that one's a little bit more complex. Main point, there's all kinds of scientific reasons, philosophical reasons why we absolutely know that the universe began to exist. It's not eternal. The reason why this is significant is because once you establish that the universe began to exist, it has a beginning point. The universe began to exist at some point in the past. It begs a very important question. We naturally want to say, well, what caused it to begin? What caused the universe? So let's just think a little bit about that cause. When we think about, okay, what could have caused the universe? For one, we know that whatever caused the universe was outside of nature. Another way of putting it is supernatural. Why do we know this? Think about it. The very thing that we're trying to explain is the cause of the natural universe. We're trying to explain the origin of nature itself. So whatever caused that can't itself be a part of nature, but must be outside of nature, supernatural. At the beginning of the universe, we know that all time, space, and matter came into existence. So whatever caused it must be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial, or non-physical, like a mind. In addition, whatever caused the universe must be extremely powerful, right? To be able to create the entire universe out of nothing. In addition, I'm not going to really defend this, but because it's a little bit more complex, I think there's also good reasons to think that the cause of the universe must have been a personal agent, because only a personal agent could will something into existence out of a timeless state. Meaning, when we reflect on what could possibly be the cause of the universe, what we're left with is a supernatural, timeless, spaceless, non-physical, powerful personal agent. This sounds a lot like something. This sounds a lot like what theists are talking about when they talk about God. A lot of people misrepresent arguments like this. A lot of people kind of say these are just arguments from ignorance. So people will say basically, hey, you people who believe in God, there's something that you don't understand, like the cause of the universe, and so you just say God did it. But notice that that's not what's happening at all. This isn't an argument from ignorance. This is an argument from specifically what we know. This is saying, no, we know a lot about the beginning of the universe. And deductively, logically, from that, we can conclude that whatever caused it must be a supernatural, timeless, spaceless, non-physical, powerful personal agent. And just because that you don't like that sounds a lot like God, that doesn't make it untrue. Beyond that, or one other kind of pushback to first cause type arguments is a lot of people will ask, they'll say, well, if God caused the universe, then what caused God? And what I want you to see right away is just how this question is wrong-headed. Nothing caused God. God isn't the type of thing that needs a cause. Why? Because God's eternal. And eternal things don't need causes. Remember, the argument isn't that everything needs a cause. The argument is that everything that begins to exist needs a cause. And if, lest you think this is cheating, this is exactly the move that the atheist is trying to make with respect to the universe. The whole reason why atheists so desperately want to hold to an eternal universe is because then you don't have to explain what caused it. It doesn't make sense if it's eternal to say what caused it. There's going to be still a lot of other things that you need to explain. But God doesn't need a cause. Beyond that, there's actually logical reasons to know that there actually has to be some sort of uncaused first cause of the universe. So this is basically Aristotle's argument. Let's go back to that question. If God caused the universe to exist, what caused God to exist? Let's say I answer that question. I'm like, well, God number 2 caused God to exist. What's going to be the immediate follow-up question? Well, what caused God number 2? Right? Oh, well, I got an answer to that too. God number 3. And do you see how this line of questioning is going to continue and go on forever, right? We're just going to keep, well, God number 4 created God number 3. And it's just going to go on forever. It's going to create this infinite regress. And the problem with that kind of infinite regress is that we would never actually be able to explain the very thing that we're trying to explain in the first place, which is the cause of the universe. Meaning that chain has to stop somewhere in order to explain existence at all. There has to be some sort of uncaused first cause of everything. Something that itself is uncaused that explains the existence of everything. There has to be, logically, just the mere fact that the universe exists means that that's necessary. And what I want you to see, there must be an uncaused first cause. That just is what theists are talking about when they refer to God, right? That is just what we're talking about. When we talk about God, we're talking about that uncaused, transcendent explanation of everything that exists. That just is what we're referring to. And that type of thing must exist. Logically, it's necessary just to explain existence in general. Beyond first cause type arguments, there's a lot of arguments from design. And here, once again, before we get into the arguments for design, I want to explain what arguments for design are not. A lot of people think that what we're saying when we say, hey, there's design in the universe is we're effectively saying, hey, there are some super complex things out there that we can't explain, so we're just going to say God designed it. But that's not what these arguments at all. Arguments from design are trending on the fact that as human beings, as rational beings, we're actually very good at detecting when things have indications of design and when they don't. Let me just give you an example. Let's say you're playing a hand of poker, or you're playing poker with a friend. If your friend pulls up this hand on top, you're not going to think twice about it. If your friend in 5 cards draws this hand on the bottom, you might think that there's something fishy at play. You might think that there's something questionable. You might think that there's design at play, that maybe they set that up. If they pull that second hand twice in a row, you're going to know that there's something fishy going on, right? Why? Why is it that with the first hand, you don't question it? The second hand, you think that there's some sort of design, there's intention, there's some cheating going on. Part of it has to do with just how improbable that second hand is. It's not likely to get that hand by chance. But it can't just be the improbability of it, because technically the top hand is equally as improbable. So it's the fact that it's not only highly improbable, it's not likely you get that hand by chance, but also that hand conforms to a certain recognizable pattern. And that pattern in this case happens to be that it's the best hand in poker. So if someone draws that a couple times, it's like, all right, you're cheating. Hopefully you weren't gambling in the first place, but you still don't want to lose. Let me give you another example. Which of these mountains were designed and which one just happened by chance? Right? It's obvious. You naturally recognize which one is designed. It's Mount Rushmore. Why? How do you instantly know that one's designed and the other one just happened by chance? Well, one, it's very complex. It's not likely that would happen just kind of just by nature. It's highly improbable that a mountain would form that way. But notice, once again, it's not just improbability, because it's highly improbable that a mountain would form exactly that way, too. It's also that it conforms to this recognizable pattern. Those are the presidents of the United States. And so what I just want you to see is that we're very good at recognizing when things are designed and when they're not. And that first picture of Mount Rushmore is clearly designed. This is what design arguments are built on. We typically recognize design when we see these two conditions. There's probably more conditions, but these are very important conditions. When we see that something is not only very complex, but it conforms to a very recognizable pattern. And when we see that, we naturally see design. We can see which things in here are designed and what's not. When we look out at the universe itself, there are a lot of things that have these fingerprints of design on them. I'm going to give you just one example, but there are so many more examples in this. The fine-tuning of the universe. I'm going to make this really simple. The fine-tuning of the universe is effectively that when we look at the universe itself, kind of the structure, the makeup of the universe, what scientists have been kind of really stunned to discover is that the universe itself is just perfectly set up for life to exist. Meaning there are a ton of conditions out there that even if one small thing was changed in like the slightest fraction, no life could possibly exist in the entire universe. We look at something like that, and we naturally and rightfully recognize fingerprints of design. Why? Because not only is it highly complex, when you look at the probabilities of the universe being the way that it is, it's like astronomical. It's literally impossible. But it's not just that it's highly complex, it's that it conforms to this really recognizable pattern. The universe itself was clearly set up for life. It really shouldn't be this way. And so we see something like that, and we naturally and rightfully say, that was designed. That was set up. That didn't just happen by chance. And if it was designed, well, then you need a designer. And so this serves as further evidence for God's existence. There are many other arguments for God's existence. There's arguments from morality. Many aspects of morality are very difficult to explain without God. There's arguments from consciousness. Consciousness, the fact that there are conscious beings with minds, makes a lot more sense in a theistic world than it does in a naturalistic world. It's a lot easier to explain these things when you start with mind than when all you do is start with matter. Given that God is a personal agent, I think that we can have personal experiences of God that serve as evidence. And this is a big reason why I think a lot of you in this room are justified in believing in God, or were justified in believing God, even before you had access to maybe this evidence and these arguments. I don't spend a lot of time focusing on personal experience for a couple reasons. For one, your personal experience with God may serve as good justification for you to believe, but your experience doesn't serve as good reasons for other people to believe. And so I try to focus on kind of objective evidence that we all have equal access to. Beyond that, experience is just notoriously difficult to properly interpret, and what you do with it. I'll just leave it at that. The point really being, there are dozens and dozens of very good, I'm not just talking about just like shotgun arguments out there, very good, valid, sound arguments for God's existence. There are few, if any, arguments or evidence against God's existence. And if you don't believe me, we've spent whole classes, there's videos on us looking at the problem of evil. I've talked about different things like how God's sovereignty is compatible with human freedom. These arguments just all fail. And once again, the problem isn't that there aren't possible ways to provide evidence of God's existence. It's just that these ways fail. And to me, that makes perfect sense because God exists. So the point being really that the state of the evidence is such that it is rational to believe in God's existence, and it's actually irrational to disbelieve or withhold judgment. I don't think there's any rational way to justify atheism or agnosticism. God exists. This really changes everything. God's existence, this proposition that we're talking about, is so vitally important. I think it's the most fundamental proposition or idea in all of existence, because once God enters the picture, that just changes everything. It changes your whole worldview. What God's existence does, it allows meaning and purpose and design to enter into existence and reality. Not only that, at this point, all we've really done is shown that God exists. So basically defended just like mere theism alone. So we haven't in any way shown that Christianity itself is true. But what I want to say is that it's a very short logical step from theism to Christian theism, from God exists to the God of Scripture exists. That jump, we haven't made it yet, so that's really it's its own class. But that logical step is much shorter than people think. Once you get to God's existence, it's almost like a slippery slope to Christianity. And one reason that I bring this up is because God's existence alone, although it's very important, right? I've been arguing for that. It's also a weird stopping point. Meaning if you just leave yourself at just mere theism, which a lot of people do, right? A lot of people say, yeah, I believe there's some sort of God out there, or I believe in some sort of higher power. That is actually a very strange and I think irrational stopping point. Why would you stop there? You mean you believe in a higher power that explains all of reality, that explains this incredible design that we see in this universe, that clearly shows that whoever created all this cares deeply about his creation, and he hasn't revealed himself any further? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. This God cares so deeply about his creation. Does he not have a plan for the negative aspects of reality, the suffering and evil that we see? It doesn't make sense to stop there. And so just what I want you to see is once you continue this logical train, even though we haven't done it yet, you're not only going to end up with, yes, God exists, but specifically the Christian God exists.